this isn't a focus of our discussion tonight, it is a reminder that the interconnectedness of our communities means that we are truly all in this together and will depend on each other to move beyond it. Tonight, our panel of experts will explore what they are seeing from their respective vantage points about how we can support survivors and educate our communities to move forward in safe, respectful, and meaningful ways. We encourage your participation in tonight's discussion. If you have questions or comments, please jot them down in the Q&A chat anytime during the forum. While you will not receive confirmation that the question has been received, rest assured there are staff who are monitoring this feature, and we will address the most frequently asked questions during the last section of the forum. And now I would like to invite our esteemed panel of experts to take this time to introduce themselves, the entity they represent, and a little about their responsibilities. And we will begin with Attorney General Aaron Ford.
Well, good evening, everyone. Sue, it's great to see you, and it's great to see the distinguished panel members, Ross, Denise, and Sheriff. Great to see you, sir. I am Aaron Ford. I'm your Attorney General, and delighted to be here for this particular conversation. My responsibility in this area is multifaceted. We have an ombudsman in my office who works in the area of sexual and domestic violence, and who is very much integrated into the work that other organizations do. We have resources that we provide relative to finances to organizations, direct victim-based resources as well. We run the bind system, which keeps victims notified of issues associated with their cases, and just all in all attempt to endeavor to keep the conversations going and to keep the resources flowing and available. We're intimately familiar with the fact that marriage license fees have gone down, and have actually received information about that as well, and look forward to trying to find new and creative ways to assist where we can. I also chair a number of committees that relate to domestic violence as well. So again, delighted to be here to engage in this conversation. I do believe it's going to be a great one. So thank you, Sue.
Thank you. And now the Administrator of the Division of Child and Family Services, Ross Armstrong.
Thank you, Sue, and thanks for having me on this panel tonight. I'm Ross Armstrong. I'm the Administrator for the Division of Child and Family Services. I actually started my state career as a special prosecutor in the Attorney General's office, focused on domestic violence cases in rural Nevada. So that was my first state job, and it has been a thread in everything I've done since. I've been the administrator at DCFS for the last 2.5 years. We oversee really 4 systems in Nevada: child welfare, juvenile justice, children's mental health, and then we're also the largest funder of victim services. And so domestic violence, violence and crime in general is woven through all of our responsibilities, and I look forward to serving on the panel this evening.
Great, thank you so much. And now Washoe County Sheriff Darin Balaam.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Sue, for hosting this. And like the Attorney General said, I'm honored to be on this panel with everybody. I'm Washoe County Sheriff Darin Balaam. So my responsibilities are law enforcement, both the enforcement, but I also look at it as the prevention side. So we respond, take those initial calls for service. We have the investigative arm, so I have a domestic violence detective that follows up, as well as a victim advocate that collaborates with the Attorney General's office and many other nonprofits and other agencies throughout the Washoe County region. I was one of the first members on the Attorney General's domestic violence fatality team. I chaired the one here in Washoe County, and so moving forward, it's been one of our goals of how do we truly break that chain of violence. So hopefully I'm looking forward to this panel to see how we continue to move that forward and truly make a difference and break that chain.
Great, thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, Denise Yoxheimer, Executive Director of the Domestic Violence Resource Center. Denise?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And on behalf of the Domestic Violence Resource Center, I'd like to thank Sue and our panel, all of our special guests who are joining us this evening, as well as our very generous sponsors who helped to make this evening possible. So thank you for being a part of this conversation. The Domestic Violence Resource Center was founded in 1977 as the Committee to Aid Abused Women, becoming the first agency in the state of Nevada to provide residential services for victims of domestic violence and their families. Today, our organization serves domestic violence survivors and their families in Washoe County with trauma-informed services, again, for the entire family. To give you a sense of how many services we do provide, last fiscal year, our organization provided 10,600 victim contacts. We provided shelter and advocacy to 350 individuals in our residential program alone. And our staff and volunteers answered more than 2,600 crisis calls. So we have a great team here. Again, we are very fortunate for the team that we have with us this evening and are looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Denise. So as you can see, we have experts from both the state and the local levels. I think this will bring us a blend of perspectives that will provide us with a really balanced insight into this issue. So to begin this question, let me ask a question of all of the panelists. 7 months into this pandemic, can each of you summarize from your experience the significant trends and challenges affecting domestic violence victims, their families, and our communities, and feel free to share any data or statistics associated with those trends, as well as details about how your organization provides assistance. And again, we will start with Attorney General Ford.
Sure. So, all of the numbers I'm going to provide you are comparisons between March and August of 2019 and March through August of 2020. In the Attorney General's office, we've seen a 75% increase in victims served through the Ombudsman Division, through that division there. Statewide, new shelter-related residents has seen an increase by 37%. We've seen an increase of 42% in the number of adult and children bed nights, and our hotline and crisis intervention calls have increased by 42%. As I understand it, Clark County LV MPD calls for infield advocacy have increased by 75%. And the shelter bed nights, victims fleeing lethal situations has increased by 45%. And the hotline calls for resources and support that they can receive through that have increased by 21%. And as regards those comparisons, that's between March and August of 2019 and February and August of 2020. So, as we anticipated, and as we all know, instances of domestic violence and the need for services tends to increase in times of stress and uncertainty. And COVID has absolutely brought that to bear. And these numbers, I think, flesh that out.
Absolutely. Sheriff Balaam, would you like to speak to this question?
Absolutely. So what we initially saw at the beginning stages of COVID was an increase in our calls for service, especially our family related. We saw a dip a little bit in the number of arrests we had, and we still are looking at that. I don't know at this time, looking at the data, if there were more people that were home, so the early arguments occurred, but that's one of the things we're looking at. But as we started to reopen, what we have seen is an increase in every category. So our calls for service, our cases taken, our arrests, they're throughout the region, and not only just in Washoe County, so throughout the entire Washoe County region. They are up 21% in arrests, 29% in domestic violence cases. Our calls for service are up 8%. So we're back to pre-COVID and higher calls. The one thing, that we saw initially in our victim advocates were asking as we saw victims was when we were in that lockdown period, We saw a lot more calls, a lot less cases of, was that because the victims couldn't get away from their batterer because they were all locked down at home? So that's one thing we've been trying to go through and cultivate as we go through those cases with our victim advocate, is how, if we remain in lockdown or some of this COVID where people are working from home, not going to work, so now the batterers are home, how do we get to those victims and get them out of that where they feel safe because now their batterer's home? So that's something we've been looking at and studying throughout this COVID and looking to the future.
Great, thank you so much. Administrator Armstrong.
Yeah, so our response really to COVID, there's kind of two prongs. There's the initial actual disease response and then all the secondary ones. And so in terms of that initial response, we have both the Victims of Crime Assistance Grant Program, and now we have the Victims of Crime Compensation Program. We've talked a little bit about the Marriage License Program. That also is operated by the Division of Child and Family Services. And so very quickly, within the first couple of months, we saw the collapse of funding for the marriage license funding come in. And so our initial response related to domestic violence was really trying to figure out if we could reallocate some federal funds to stop the bleeding there, and then also to work with Sue and the coalition with our access to the state's chief medical officer to provide any guidance we could in terms of protocols for shelters to operate safely to prevent the spread or shutdown of an entire shelter. And so that was really our first response. The secondary ones are really coming to light now in a bigger way. And so, you know, we initially saw a collapse, like an absolute collapse in reports to the Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline, 30, 40% in some cases in a month. And it was all because kids weren't in school. You know, we have teachers who are trained to identify child abuse and neglect, who have eyes on these kids, who notice when the kid that's been in their class something isn't quite right. And so we lost that resource in the community. We've worked to do some public awareness campaigns in terms of that. And what we saw in the mid-summer coming into the fall is an increase in the percentage of removals from homes. So kids being removed from their home and placed into foster care on the basis of domestic violence. And so since the pandemic started, 167 kids statewide have been removed from their homes on the basis of domestic violence. You know, it's kind of in the 7 to 10% range normally. In June, 19% of the removals we had in child welfare were due to a domestic violence cited as the primary reason for removal. And so certainly a concern there in terms of an increase. We know that there's, you know, increased economic stressors on the home and all of that. Also this last month, we had the highest number of calls into our children's mobile crisis line. So when a family has a child in crisis, they call our mobile crisis line. October shattered our highest previous number. So the long-term effects on families is really difficult. We also operate the confidential address program at the Division of Child and Family Services, and we ran into issues, you know, with the unemployment, because that program allows victims who fear for their safety to have a confidential address where there's like this vacant lot in Carson City where all their mail goes to, and we collect it each day. But they all have the same address. And so as our victims became unemployed, they were getting flagged as fraudulent in the unemployment system. And so, you know, as soon as that was flagged, that was like, you know, a 2 or 3 hour, let's come up with a solution to help those victims. So it really has been a multi-front response on our end, both just in terms of the actual disease itself, but then all of those secondary effects that we're now seeing affect children and families that have that intersection with domestic violence.
Thank you. That's thank you for all that you do, and also I'm sorry that all of that has to happen at this point in time. So let's end this section of questions with Ms. Yoxheimer. So Denise, would you like to respond to this question?
Sure, thank you so much. The issues that the population that we serve are for the most part unchanging. The families that we serve need shelter, they need employment, they need food, they need transportation. and support and advocacy from our organization. There has been, as you have all indicated, a recent dramatic increase in the need for all of the services that we can provide, along with the decreasing resources and support that we have to provide those services with. From January to June in 2020, compared with the same time period in 2019, we experienced a 50% increase in calls to our emergency hotline. And during this same time frame, we also experienced a 30% increase in motel bed nights, which was in response to an increasing need for shelter during the pandemic. In mid-March, we decided, obviously, that we could no longer take new shelter residents into our existing shelter facility. So we worked very hard within our shelter team and also within the community to raise funds and raise sources of support so that we could expand our shelter program into alternative settings in the community, utilizing local motels. This was critically important to help maintain the safety and security of our staff and the residents that we had at the shelter when the COVID broke out, while also allowing us to continue to provide the services that we need to provide to others in the community. Again, we're very, very grateful for the community support that we received for this initiative. We raised more than $30,000 from March through June to help fund this alternative way of providing motel support. One other dramatic increase in the need for services that we have seen has to do with our TPO services. During that same January to June timeframe of 2020 over 2019, we saw an increased need for services of 81% for TPO support and services. We also saw some new and emerging areas where clients needed new forms of new support that we hadn't typically provided to them in the past. Specifically, we received a lot of requests for support with completing stalking and harassment orders, largely from Spanish speakers in our community. They were referred to us and continue to be referred to us by many various sources, including law enforcement and the courts. And these individuals face several significant barriers, including language barriers, barriers with technology, transportation, and more. And fortunately, our staff was able to rise to the occasion and work to meet that need. And also we saw for the first time, and Ross kind of touched on this, requests for assistance filing unemployment claims, which is something that we had typically not had experience doing, but worked to educate our staff, our bilingual staff, to help meet that need and file those claims on behalf of the clients that we serve. And then finally, we've seen a dramatic increase in requests for rental assistance. That comes along with the unemployment claims assistance. Of course, both are tied specifically to the economic crisis that comes along with COVID in our state.
Thank you so much. Again, appreciate all that y'all do, and it is so hard to know that the need is so great. We're gonna not really switch gears so much, but we're gonna focus on asking questions of each of you, specific questions. And so Sheriff Balaam, you're up first this time. Certainly law enforcement has been much in the news over the last 7 months. You've talked a little bit about the increase in calls and responses, both in your agency and just countywide. But can you talk to us a little bit about other impacts that the pandemic has had on law enforcement's response to domestic violence, concern about, going into homes, addressing individuals, and can you also talk to us about whether there is a fairly consistent and predictable profile of an abuser, and whether that profile has changed at all during this time?
Absolutely. So, on the first, our response, I think you hit on it, was we've seen, and all of us have talked about it, the increase for calls for service. So we know these are our most violent and dangerous calls, typically for law enforcement. So we always send 2 deputies to those type of calls. So with those increased calls for service, it's required a lot more manpower. As Denise hit with the TPOs, a lot of those TPOs come through my office. So although evictions have been put on hold over the last couple of months, we have seen an increase in the TPO service. And doing that, I know the victim advocate has been collaborating with Denise and others. And so we have also seen an increase in that. So it's required a lot more manpower, both for the victims. And again, COVID has done some strange things that, you know, all of us are experiencing for the first time, but trying to get, and Denise hit on it, trying to get housing, trying to get them jobs. And now, again, you have that batterer who may have been working, or maybe the victim was working and getting out of that home, and now they were all home. So now we're looking at how do we get out? And when we had, you know, for us up here, some of our larger places, casinos and stuff that would we could work with when they were initially shut down, it made it a little more difficult to find housing for some of our victims to get them out of that thing. As far as what we know fairly consistently, I'd say consistently that profile for a batterer hasn't changed. You know, some of the things you always see is it's an individual who's very controlling. It's an individual who tries to get that victim and isolate them from their family and friends, and then emotionally, mentally, physically starts breaking down their confidence, so that they solely rely upon that batterer for everything from financial to housing to food to safety. And so they think that is the one and only person that can keep them safe. And that, you know, again, we hear it all the time. All of us hear this from when we go talk to victims. Well, he didn't mean to do it this time. He apologized. So for the basic profile, that's what I would tell you. Oftentimes, again, we see that underlying issue. They have some type of addiction issue or anger issue. So anger, alcohol, drugs is mixed into that. So when they get home from work or whatever, minus COVID, they are extremely stressed out. They try to decompress that way. And then next thing you know, they've lost their anger or lost the control of themselves, and they end up battering both the victim and if there's kids in the place. Well, I would say, what have we seen changed over COVID is now, I think all of us have hit on it, is that COVID has brought stresses that none of us anticipated. So now you see, you know, whatever couples that were doing fine, they both lost their job. Now they're worrying about either paying for their rent, paying for their bills, paying for their house, whatever it is. And so a typical family that may not have had any issues, now compounded with COVID, now compounded if they have kids that had to be pulled out of school. Now are they back in school? Are they not? Those additional stressors have kind of changed the profile. So some people that may never have fit the profile, they're not controlling, they didn't have any drug or alcohol issues, but you add in and compound COVID on that. And what we've seen is a lot of families, they're emotionally, mentally strained, financially strained, and they've hit their tipping point. And we've been trying to do a lot of outreach. Again, we've been talking to our deputies about, again, when they went in, we've outfitted them all. So initially in those calls, we would, and we still do, we screen, ask them if somebody's been around or has any signs or symptoms. But then when we go in, we're trying to do a little more additional investigation in the front end. So how, if it's just a verbal argument, how can we get to the root cause and maybe bring some resources in? But again, I think Denise hit on it, Ross hit on it, because of financially, because of volunteers and at COVID, we're having a very difficult time trying to find those resources because everybody's at home. So I got to say my staff's been extremely creative, and everybody in our region has been extremely creative and passionate. And that's how we're looking. And that's what's kind of changed with COVID is people that wouldn't fit the profile, but they've lost their job. They're now worried about where they're going to live, or they lost their place to live and affording their cars and stuff. They're now fitting that profile because they're stressed.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much. So let's turn to Administrator Armstrong. Psychological and physical mistreatment has long-lasting emotional and physical ramifications for victims and children who witness the abuse. There can be permanent medical, emotional, social, and professional harm. We can't see into the future, but is the abuse you're seeing now more frequent, severe, and dangerous than in non-pandemic times, or have the trends in the victimization remained consistent?
So the mental health part of my job is the one I was least familiar with coming into it, but I've learned a lot. And the main thing I've learned specifically about children's mental health is something called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And it is a way to track and monitor adverse childhood experiences such as physical, emotional, sexual abuse, neglect, or other household trauma that can have long-term effects. And so, there's a ACEs screen, and if you have a child who reaches 4 or higher on the screen, they are, more likely actually to die as adults of Alzheimer's and heart disease and other long-lasting things. And so, we know that the impact of trauma on the young brain will last long after this crisis is particularly gone. I have, anecdotal reports with not really any solid data in terms of our child welfare workers are seeing more severe domestic violence cases when they go out on them. Something that we had identified last summer and worked with Sue on is that the child welfare response to domestic violence cases is not as refined as it should be. And so we're certainly working on that. But we've definitely had, notes just from the field of when we go out on domestic violence cases now, they are worse than we have had before. And I think that's reflected in those increased numbers for removals. All domestic violence is bad, but we know there's that spectrum. And so we're definitely getting called out on more horrifying situations for our workers. And we know that those families that are seeking mental health services with us now, about 41%, it's about that financial stress of losing the job. Actually 15%, and I have the August numbers, 15% of the families seeking mental health services from DCFS in August was because they either had a family member die of COVID or was sick with COVID. And so the disease itself remains a stressor. And so our mental health team, we work hand in hand with the Division of Public and Behavioral Health. We're treating COVID as an adverse childhood experience, right? Whether that's being shut off from your friends at school or the loss of income for your family or instability in housing, this is going to be an adverse time, and how do we respond to it? I talked about the mobile crisis numbers earlier. One trend that is not good, especially out of our Reno office, is that the number of cases we're able to stabilize without hospitalization are down. So when mobile crisis goes out, they try to stabilize with community supports. There's either not that access because COVID has shut down providers, or the stressors are so much that hospitalization is required. So again, I bring all the bad news on my question, but we do have an incredibly dedicated team at DCFS and the local child welfare agencies that are continuing to work on these issues and partner with community providers like those who provide victim services. So the good thing is we are now data focused and able to take that and turn that into action. So that is our approach right now. But it's been a very difficult last 6-7 months.
Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you very, very much for that answer. It has been a time which none of us will ever forget, I am sure. So, Ms. Yoxheimer, we're going to turn the question to you. Business and school closures and shelter-in-place orders presented a perfect storm for abusers and their victims. There was an initial drop in domestic violence hotline calls after the stay-at-home order was implemented. And as it has been slowly lifted, we've seen an increase in calls and needs for services. Can you talk a little more about these trends? And are there particular challenges or issues as it relates to immigrants and other diverse or vulnerable populations?
Thank you. And before I get into responding to that question, I thought I would just mention in response to some of the comments that Ross made, that we feel very fortunate at our organization, and I know many, if not most, of the other domestic violence organizations in the state of Nevada are able, thanks largely to private foundation support in our case, to provide trauma-informed counseling for both our child and adult clients and residents of our shelter and our 19 transitional housing units in the community. So it's certainly not enough based on the circumstances and the situation that Ross cited, but we will continue to seek private funding to provide counseling and those kinds of services that children need, particularly during this time. We are very, very aware that the children in our domestic violence shelter and also in our transitional housing units, they're coping with being in a shelter or in a transitional housing situation, and now they're coping with issues relative to the pandemic on top of that. So within our shelter team, we've spent a lot of time over the last 7 or 8 months talking about what we can attempt to do to better normalize their experiences living, in a pandemic within a pandemic. So the needs of the children that we serve are always very much front and center, as I know they are with all of you as well. To answer your question though, Sue, actually, our organization did not see an initial drop in hotline calls. As I mentioned earlier, we saw a 50% increase in hotline calls pretty much right off the bat. And that increase has remained consistent throughout the pandemic to date. And we're very carefully monitoring how our organization can work to continue to meet these increased needs with decreasing resources in a safe and sustainable way. But definitely, as several of you have touched on, the pandemic has dramatically increased the real and the potential risk of domestic violence in our community. Closures of workplaces, schools, the shelter-in-place orders really do present that perfect storm because social isolation is one of the most commonly used tactics by perpetrators of domestic violence. And you add stress, economic anxiety, as Sheriff Balaam referenced, joblessness, and a general sense of the unknown on top of that isolation. And this creates a very significant and dangerous situation in our community, as well as a huge global concern. The United Nations Population Fund predicts that 15 million additional cases of domestic violence will occur as the result of the COVID lockdowns. So I think that just further paints the picture that the impact of this pandemic will continue to live on, both for those of us here in Nevada and the Northern Nevada community, and obviously globally for a long time to come.
Great, thank you so much. Now we're going to turn to Attorney General Ford. Your office has a history of supporting domestic violence survivors by pursuing public policy changes to better protect our communities. Can you talk a bit about those efforts, and do you intend to bring forward any new policy proposals to address the challenges that have emerged due to the pandemic? And if so, what assistance can the community provide?
Yeah, happy to talk about that. And I want to back up and give credit where it's due. And shame on me, Nicole just got married, and I'm calling her by her last name, O'Bannon, and she's going to kill me. I'm so sorry, Nicole. But Nicole is our ombudsman in our office for domestic violence, and she's our program manager, as I've indicated, for the victim information notifications, everyday system, the VINE system. She directs our victim services, resources, referrals, legal counsel, accompaniment, court appointments, advocacy with child welfare, DA's offices and city attorney's offices as well. She works with pro bono attorneys for issues that fall outside of the scope of the state's VINE system, VINE victim legal services, and she does so much more. So I just wanted to call her out by name because she does so much in office, and she is the reason why we will continue being so successful in our office on a going forward basis, specifically, Sue, to your question about policy changes. The short answer is yes, we do intend to bring forth some things. Listen, COVID-19, we all know, is a public health crisis. And in my estimation, so is domestic violence. It's a public health crisis, and it's one that has devastated our state for years. We've been at the top of the bad lists, as we all know. Unfortunately, we saw that these two problems have collided this year. And so we want to do what we can to help. Our Unfortunately, our settlement funds have been depleted as well. We talked again about the marriage licensing fee being something that has been depleted or has at least diminished, and we are unable to help there. But from a policy perspective, we try to do what we can to help. And so, we will continue offering direct services and facilitating donations from the private sector, such as we did with Aaron's Rents. We got mattresses, 500 of them, and we distributed them to domestic violence shelters, but also homeless shelters throughout the state. And we worked with Uber to get free rides for domestic violence victims and survivors, so that they didn't have to stay home when home was the problem, right? And so looking forward, my office is going to be sponsoring bills on domestic violence issues next legislative session, and we'll be working with other legislators and stakeholders to help address domestic violence in our state. We can't legislate our way out of this pandemic, though, and nor will legislation end domestic violence. I think we've known that forever. We continue to add to the books on that, trying to help where we can. If we could, it'd be already done. Legislation is one tool that we can use to address the problem, though. A big concern for many domestic violence service providers, as I've indicated, is lack of funding. And because few people got married, we're unable to get that money. And I'm not certain that legislatively we'll be able to rely upon the legislature to be able to do it. They're broke like everybody else. And it's going to be a very difficult time for us to try to figure that out. So, we're going to be working again with our legislative counterparts, as well as our law enforcement colleagues, to figure out ways in which we can augment laws out there, strengthen them, remove burdens or barriers from law enforcement's ability to prosecute these types of offenses, and stay tuned for that. So we look forward to working with you all. I'm going to withhold. I'm going to use the privilege of withholding what our topics are right now until we get them finalized. But stay tuned. This way I can keep it coming back. How about that?
Perfect. Yes, and we're here to partner with you in any way that we can. We're going to have one final question for the panelists that I'm going to pose. I'm hoping you all are putting questions in the chat, the question and answer chat, so that we'll have plenty to ask after this one. And this is one for everyone. Society has recently accepted that intimate partner abuse is not a private affair. The consequences that emerge from this issue involve child welfare, homelessness, education, healthcare, business productivity, employment, and overall community safety and well-being. Where do strategic partnerships fit within this picture? How can we, individuals and organizations, work together to raise awareness, promote prevention, support victims, and keep domestic violence from slipping back into being a private matter? And we're going to start this time with Ms. Yoxheimer.
Okay, thank you so much, Sue. Well, obviously, strategic partnerships, both in the private sector and also with our governmental funders and others, are critically important. We are so fortunate to have the support and the guidance of Sue and her team at the Nevada Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence to help us kind of lead the way in some of these partnerships that we have going on here in our state. Within our organization, we know that communication and commitment to education is really a critical key. We've been so fortunate to have had the support of collaborative partners in helping train our staff and our team and our volunteers and our board so that we can all become better advocates for victims of domestic violence in the community and do a better job of telling the story about domestic violence victims so they don't remain in the closet per se. And we are also very happy to always provide our support and our resources to others in the community who might need additional collaborative partnerships as well. Recently, our organization launched a speakers bureau with the primary intent of sending board members and staff out into the community to businesses, large and small, community organizations as well, to talk about domestic violence and how it impacts everyone in our community. And our goal there is 100% just to raise awareness of the issue and try to maintain enhanced visibility about the issue of domestic violence and how it really does impact everyone we know. So we would be more than happy to offer that as a resource to anyone who would like to have a presentation in their workplace or their community organization about domestic violence, because we are very motivated, as Sue mentioned, to continue to enhance the visibility of this issue and make sure that the victims in our community know that they're not alone.
Great, thank you. Administrator Armstrong, if you can remember back to that long question that I asked.
I can. Thank you, mostly because you provided it to me, so I'm good to go. You know, I think the important part about strategic partnerships is, again, that immediate response. So, you know, we heard from shelters like we need PPE, and so we, you know, try to tap into our state resources, and I think even like drove a box up to your office to get those gloves out there. And so you need partnerships that allow for action. You know, this conversation is great, but we also have to have action. And so, you know, for me, pre-COVID, we had realized that that intersection of domestic violence and child welfare was not working well, and abusers are pretty crafty, and so they were pretty good at using the victim service system and the child welfare system as weapons against each other in these cases. And so, you know, we spent some time talking and coming up with some solutions, which we're hoping to move forward very soon in terms of training for both systems, and then some policy changes so we can do better there. And then just continuing to have that open dialogue and to echo what Attorney General Ford said in terms of domestic violence being a public health crisis and a health issue. And for me, that's been a personal transformation from being that prosecutor in the courtroom where like, this is a criminal justice and I'm the solution to this problem on every single case, to like, no, like, let's take a real health approach. Let's, you know, take a look at the data that we have and be responsive to those bigger trends, knowing that the boots on the ground, the great work that you all do as victim service providers to respond to that emergency and be that supportive way to really develop a system where we can tap into those strategic partnerships that we need on an individual basis in a time of crisis for a particular case, but in that broader perspective as well.
Perfect. Great. Sheriff Balaam, how would you like to weigh in on strategic partnerships?
You know, I think besides what Ross and Denise have said, the ultimate thing is we got to continue these type of conversations and collaboration, especially during this time of COVID, of how do we go out, how do we make sure we make those victims feel safe, whether it's coming to our agency, whether it's going to Denise's organization, but reaching out some way, somehow, and knowing, and this is where it falls on all our shoulders, that we are going to act and respond. You know, the one thing, and I talked about it over the last year, about a new program here we want to bring that measures lethality, as well as integrating with the batterers and not just the victims. So again, we know batterers, many of them, somewhere in their life, they were a victim and they may have experienced that. So I was just back at the University of Louisville Monday and Tuesday and met with a captain at High Point, North Carolina, where they have a very successful domestic violence program that they have. So we're looking to bring him out. And in that, again, that's where the strategic collaboration comes of bringing a lot of our nonprofits in, a lot of our service providers. This isn't just, we can't arrest our way out of it. Just like the Attorney General said, you can't legislative your way out of it. This is going to take everybody working together and pulling every single lever that we have, whether it's the judicial, the legislation, the community resources, and continuing to reassure our victims that we are going to be there for them, and when they call, that we respond. And so those are the things we're looking forward to, and I think we can continue. And ultimately, I think Ross hit it, we can talk and talk, but we have to have that action. And I think that's where our next step as we come out of this COVID is to make sure that as they've been maybe isolated in their homes with those batterers, that when they finally get out and reach out, that we absolutely respond in action and make sure we protect those victims and take care of the batterers, and we do what we need to with them, and ultimately look for those underlying issues of how do we address and help the victims as well as the batterers as they go through the process. So when they come out, hopefully they're not a batter again, and we get our victims in a safe location.
Great, thank you so much. General Ford.
Yeah, thank you. Again, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm going to preface my comments just by saying we know we're all hurting right now, financially, mentally, emotionally. It's been a tough, year for us, and that's just real talk. That said, I'm confident that we have the ability. We're smart enough. We are savvy enough. We are creative enough to figure out ways to provide services to survivors and victims, to provide treatment, as Sheriff Balaam said, to batterers, and to continue addressing this issue even in this tough time of a pandemic. It's going to be tough. I mean, the money issue is a very real issue. It just is, right? And so we're going to have to be creative. There's nothing new under the sun. I suspect that there has been a historical occurrence whereby we can look back to see what we did last time something like this happened, to see what was successful. And we just need to be creative on that and keep doing it. So I want to offer encouragement in that regard. But to your point about this particular question, and actually to some of the questions that are in the Q&A about what community members can do, jurisdictions are beginning to develop high-risk teams, which include strong partnerships between DA offices, city attorney offices, police departments, and whatnot, social services, child welfare, and others. And these types of teams are addressing some identified domestic violence cases as soon as there is law enforcement contact, intervening at the earliest point, which works to prevent severe violence and lethality. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And as I've talked about already, local businesses and various agencies and community service organizations are working together, not only to just provide literature and awareness events, but to provide material. Aaron's Rents and I, in my office, we were, again, 500 mattresses during the time of a pandemic where we knew people would be in more desperate need than ever. And then Uber, I can't remember, it was in the thousands. I want to say 5,000, but I can't remember. But thousands of rides to people who, again, were locked in with a batterer and couldn't escape. And so they were able to use free rides from Uber through Piper Overstreet, who is a local lobbyist that I worked with out here, to get that done. And so those are the types of things we have to continue to do. If you have the wherewithal to be able to donate, if you have the wherewithal to be able to contribute, if you have the wherewithal to be able to show up, we would love for you to be able to do that and love for you to do that so that we can continue trying to help survivors, victims, and also to treat batterers. And the last thing I'll say is, in addition to those suggestions that I've mentioned, donate to organizations. The Domestic Violence Resource Center is a very good resource, obviously, for victims that are supporting that need the support. And so other organizations like that, I probably shouldn't have started naming organizations, but you get the point. Find somebody to donate to help out if you can. And that's going to be very helpful for us moving forward as well. So those are all the comments that I have on that, Sue. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And you've covered some things that that now I don't have to cover. So we're getting close to the end, but we do have some great questions from our audience. So I'm going to ask that we sort of have quick answers to some of these questions. I'm going to start with Ross. How many calls did the Child Mobile Crisis Line receive?
So, I said September was a spike month. We don't have October yet, but September we had 421 calls across the state for an average of 14 a day.
Yeah. Okay, so Sheriff Balaam, you've talked a little bit about some of the issues that are happening in the homes. Are you seeing any added stresses that due to COVID, that victims are more hesitant or intimidated to report domestic violence or following through as witnesses? Or
so absolutely, we're seeing that because again, they're stuck with that batter, so they don't have that time where maybe they were working where they can get out and make that safe phone call. Or again, the kids are home now, where before the kids may be at school, so that gave them the opportunity to reach out to us. So we are seeing that where they're a little more intimidated, again, with not being able or having a very difficult time to move victims around in our community because of everything going on. Oftentimes, again, they end up unfortunately back in that situation, and they don't want to be witnesses, and you can't blame them when they're back with that batterer. So we have seen that, absolutely.
Great. Thank you so much. So this question, both Denise and Ross may want to chime in on what is the estimated monetary loss so far this year due to the decreases in marriage license revenue. So I'm going to have Denise talk locally and Ross talk statewide.
Thank you. For our organization this year, we've experienced, I believe it's a 73% decrease in funding from the marriage license grant. So it's a very significant reduction to one of our most important sources of funding.
And that tracks right with what we had to do. So it's one of those weird funding systems where we like give out the grants, but then the money comes in monthly from the different counties, and most people are shocked and they're like, what kind of crazy system do you have where this is your only state funding for domestic violence services is like a tax on marriages? But we did. So our statewide, the award we gave for this fiscal year was $1 million, about 1 million, whereas the year before it was 3 million. We think that we may, we're watching it. We may be able to do a supplemental allocation, but about that 73% reduction is accurate for that marriage license funding reduction.
Oh, and as an aside, so if I could just real quickly say, one of the unintended consequences or responses to the COVID crisis was when we shut down everything in Clark County, we as in, the administration, that included marriages. And I recall entertaining a lawsuit dealing with marriage facilities who wanted to be able to marry folks, and some people who wanted to get married for some very real reasons, right? Aside from I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life with you, there were some other reasons people were going overseas to serve in the Army, or whatever the case may be. And so, we realized then that there was an indirect impact on these funds that we just hadn't even thought about had we not had to engage in this crisis.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Great. Thank you so much for those, all those answers. Another question that has come up, and I think General Ford certainly spoke to this, but folks want to know what, as community members, they can do to help support victims or survivors of domestic violence, and what are the greatest needs of support. So I'm going to throw this open to everyone to add on, and I'll let you choose to. Sheriff Balaam, how about you? You want to talk a little bit?
Sure, I'll do real quick. What I would say, besides I know what Attorney General Ford's already touched on and may hit again, is what they can do for our victims, besides donating everything, is encourage them to come forward, reassure them that they are going to be safe, reassure them that everything is, that they're going to be there with them. So I think that's the biggest thing for victims, besides the donations and everything of trying to help us get those services, is if you know somebody's being battered, that is the first step, is coming forward and seeking that help, whether it's services, whether, again, you can go to multiple areas, just doesn't need to be law enforcement, but coming forward and, as a friend, family member, neighbor, just somebody you see, that's being, battered on the street, step into that and be that person to reassure them that we're there to help them.
Great. Thank you so much. Denise, would you like to?
And another great way that the community can get involved to support our work is by volunteering. We had a slide earlier in the presentation that noted a 34% decrease in volunteers at our organization during the January to June timeframe of this year over last year. That's most specifically tied to our closing of our donation room during the first several months of the pandemic. So we have just started to very gently reopen that function, and we'll continue to work with volunteers in that regard. We use volunteers in a lot of other ways as well. One of the most critical and life-saving ways that we use volunteers and need them desperately is to support our 24-hour emergency hotline. And volunteers go through significant training to become a crisis line volunteers, which helps our staff to manage that function after hours, weekends, and holidays as well. We're very pleased to report that since the COVID began in mid-March, we were still able to go ahead with 2 volunteer trainings and have just very recently trained up 16 new individuals to provide additional support. And the volunteer support is really significant. During our last fiscal year, we were so fortunate to have 7,000 volunteer hours in support of our organization, which roughly equates to just under 4 full-time equivalents in terms of employees. So we really could not do this work without them, and that's yet another way to support your local domestic violence program.
Perfect, and it's a perfect segue. So as we wrap things up for this evening, and before you all leave this call, you will see a survey on your screen. Please take just a moment to answer our 2 questions. Your responses will help us better understand how you might like to be more involved in addressing the issue of domestic violence, as well as how we can further highlight issues that need additional clarification. So that will show up as at the end. Please fill it out. I want to extend a big thank you to our expert panel. I know how busy we all are, so thank you so much for taking time out of what I know are busy days to provide your valuable insight, information, and encouragement during Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So thank you so very, very much. I also want to give a special thanks to the forum title sponsors and panelist sponsors. Their contribution and support are invaluable to all of our efforts to bring peace and safety to all in our communities. And finally, I'm going to join all of the panelists and ask for your support for domestic violence programs. They are in need in communities throughout the state. You can reach out to our webpage, ncedsv.org, to learn how you can contact the DV program in your community to offer support. And last but certainly not least, thank you for participating tonight. We appreciate your support tonight, as well as all your past and all your future support. Be safe. Be well. Good night.
Good night, everybody. Great to see everybody.
Right.